Welcome to Global HR Virtual Summit 2022. Our today's guest of honor is Sile O'Donnell from Ireland. I will introduce Sile to you, dear audience, through a brief biography. Today's topic, first of all, is the role of HR and people management in the changing world of work. Sile O'Donnell is a HR consultant and an Adjunct Associate Professor in HRM, Organisational Behaviour and Organisational Development in Trinity College Dublin, Ireland. Sile is a highly accomplished HR practitioner with over 30 years of experience and achievements in the senior HR and OD role, including a number of HR director roles in large public sector organizations. Sile provides HR and OD services to numerous organizations in the Irish public sector. She has worked with many organizations during the pandemic to develop cultural change, performance management systems, workforce planning, competency framework, and equality, diversity, and inclusion policies. So welcome, Sile, to Global HR Summit. We are thankful to you for accepting this role of sharing your expertise in the HR domain with our viewers.
Thank you so much, Benita. It's lovely to be here with you today, albeit that we're here virtually. I'm delighted to be here to talk about a very important topic. Thank you.
So we go on with requesting Sile to start her presentation on the topic.
Thank you so much, Benita. I'm just going to share some slides, which are just brief slides, really to set the scene in terms of our discussion. If you can see the slides, okay, yes?
Yeah.
Super stuff. So in terms of the topic that I've chosen, I've very much chosen it because I think it's really challenging at the moment for HR professionals and indeed people managers, because we all know that over the past 2 years, we have seen disruptive change on a scale that we would never have predicted or anticipated, with all the best workforce plans and strategies in the world. So here we are almost 2 years in, and I have certainly in my own practitioner experience and in terms of my lecturing and research, I have seen many different challenges. So what I'd like to do is perhaps, and certainly to frame our conversation, Benita, is over just a short period of time, highlight some visuals, just 1 or 2 slides to, I suppose, emphasize certain challenges and indeed opportunities that I see. So very simple slide to begin with. You see a simple visual on the right-hand side with people at the center of it. And we know that since the pandemic commenced in the first quarter of 2020, we really have become much more global in ways that we never thought we would. So vast amounts of people working remotely, although it's also important to recognize that there are certain inequalities there, because a lot of frontline workers who are very much usually in lower paid roles haven't had the benefit or the privilege, for example, of remote working, and have had real impacts in terms of their livelihood, in terms of, certainly I know in Ireland, we have had repetitive lockdowns over the last 2 years and vast amounts of people unemployed with certain government supports in place. So I think there is an element of equality and inequality in a lot of things I'm going to say this morning, which is why I have a little quote on the left from the UN. And they've done a lot of research which really shows that, in fact, while, you know, in terms of talent management, there should be more opportunities. Work is no longer defined by place. It no longer matters as much where we work, how we work, because of the benefits of technology in enabling us to adapt to this disruptive world. But a lot of research shows that, in fact, that has been very much a privilege to some, and many different categories of workers, whether it's women who are primarily caregivers, those with disabilities, people of color, and various other categories, including older workers, they have not had the same opportunities, the same access to employment, lots of glass and sometimes cement ceilings there. So sometimes people get access to jobs, but there isn't, a sense of maybe a career progression path. So that's why in the little visual to start with, the scales there is about equality and inequalities and the need for inclusion. I'm going to talk about that. The ongoing effect of the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of the physical and the virtual workplace, and very much then looking at some of the challenges and the opportunities of remote working. So I'm going to talk about 3 particular HR challenges for a minute or 2, and then I'm going to talk about a 4th one. Biggest challenge, I suppose, facing all HR professionals, people, hiring managers, organizations, is the talent management challenge. And we hear a lot of, there are a lot of terminologies and terms that are used to describe the great resignation, the great rejection, the great reset, the new normal. But if you think about it, even before the pandemic, the war for talent was very much a real challenge. And that has become harder, even though it should be easier, because we're in a global environment when we're searching for talent. But certainly vast numbers of people are leaving their jobs. Some of that is because there is some research that would say that many people who maybe joined their organizations in the last year or 2 have never set foot in the physical workplace. I train hundreds of managers and staff in the Irish public sector. It's amazing the amount who've never actually seen the physical workplace. So sometimes there isn't that, the connection is a little bit weakened by the remote working, the distance. And some of this depends obviously as well on how engaged people feel, down to the bottom point. And we know from research that one of the biggest predictors of engagement is the relationship you have with your direct line manager. So regardless of HR policies, regardless of the organization, and culture plays a big part there. So how do organizations attract, develop, and retain talent in this very disruptive and changing environment? Another related challenge, I think, is the whole area of equality, diversity, and well-being. As I flagged a few minutes ago, we're actually seeing perhaps reinforcement of inequalities caused by things like access to remote working or not. In Ireland, for example, we have currently, there is a bill being drafted so that we will have legislation in the next few months giving employees, all employees, the right to request remote working. However, they're also putting in lots of reasons why it can be declined. And certainly in my experience, for huge numbers of people who work in the health sector, the education sector, frontline services, whether it's policing, transport, obviously retail, hospitality, they will never have the chance to remotely work. So there is a certain inequality in there. There's also obviously, one of the big challenges, I think, and one of the things that I observe is a lot of HR, I suppose, departments and organizations, they haven't really adapted their talent management practices. So are they broadening out their recruitment channels? How diverse are their workforces? Because very often I see cultures where there's a lot of rhetoric about we are an equal opportunities employer, we value diversity, we are inclusive. But when you actually look at their demographic profile, the workforce, you see that's not the case. And then sometimes even where people do recruit more people from underrepresented or minority groups, it can actually reinforce segregation if people come into a culture that is not genuinely inclusive. So that's a huge challenge. The third one, health, safety, and well-being. Obviously, this applies to people in the physical and the remote workplace. I'm sure it is the same in many countries. We have numerous protocols, policies, guidelines in terms of safety in the workplace. At the moment, there's a huge emphasis in my own country on a phased return to work as we're finally coming out of various restrictions and lockdowns. So all of those things are absolutely critical because, and sometimes the visibility of how safe and well people are in a remote working environment can be challenging. And well-being, absolutely critical, and it ties into it ties into the inclusion piece before, but it's also very relevant to talent management. We know from research that mental health is probably one of the most significant challenges that has faced people. And I've seen surveys of workforces where up to 70% of people are saying that their mental health has been adversely affected living and working through a pandemic. That's a big challenge. The leadership and engagement one, Benita, is very much around, it isn't just about HR professionals, it's about line managers. Do we train and support and empower and enable our line managers to be people managers? And I just want to maybe close off with some thoughts. One of the things I have observed over the last 2 years is huge learning curve for a lot of HR professionals, often wearing many hats, and that has become even more challenging during this disruptive environment we work in. So I'm just going to make a few little points, and we can come back to any of this in our conversation, Benita. So obviously, starting at the top, compliance. It's an area that some people in HR don't particularly feel comfortable working in. Others really enjoy it. So I'm talking about compliance with employment law, guidelines, regulations, COVID protocols. There's a lot of emphasis on good governance these days, and HR has a huge role to play there. That could be ensuring equality in recruitment. So I have noticed that some people hold on to that compliance piece as a power, you know, almost as a mechanism of power. Others prefer to be in the more strategic space, but certainly in my experience, it is critical. And I have found as I progress through my own HR career, it's really important for those maybe who are new to HR, maybe want to progress their careers. It's really important, I think, to have the tools of the trade. And for me, sometimes taking time to learn policies, law, understanding fair procedures, some of those nuts and bolts of HR are really important. But really, ultimately, what a lot of HR people should be focusing on are the next two. So developing good practice, best practice HR solutions to meet the needs of the business, but not just the business. There's also that employee champion role that Dave Ulrich would have talked about in his 3-box model of HR. So how do we recruit, attract, retain, develop the best people? How do we keep people engaged? What kind of programs do we need to support people's well-being? And I suppose the third one, the business partnering role, I still see that is very prevalent across organizations that I work with. This idea of partnering with the business to deliver results. That's always a challenging space for HR professionals because you're trying to ensure the compliance piece, the best practice, but ultimately meet the needs of the business. And that takes somebody with a lot of skills to do that. And sometimes needing that professional courage where you have to hold a certain position to protect the organization and the employees. The final bit is about leading organization development and change. So that's very much the OD hat of HR. Critical, really important to point out, it is not just the function of HR to lead change, cultural change in OD. Very often it's sort of sidelined to HR, but if you really want to change culture, create inclusive cultures, it has to be done through collective leadership from top down, fostering bottom-up change. But HR has a key role to be sometimes the guardian of the culture, as some would talk to me about. Top tips, and I'm going to stop then, Benita, and it's really just summing up some of the key points I've made. That talent attraction, development and retention challenge is absolutely critical. I think that is fundamental, and I think very much sometimes taking a critical role look at jobs. How are they designed? Where do, is geography important where people work? How will they take up the roles? How will we support people through EDI programs, well-being, engagement? And the final one, building the workplace of the future. A lot of us in HR are still in a very reactive mode. We're constantly reacting. There's an uncertainty in the environment. What will happen next? But it is important to take some space, and not just HR, but obviously senior managers and leaders. How do we look to the future to build the kind of workforce we need? Are we looking at our workforce profile? Where's the turnover? What is our age profile? Various workforce planning factors. So I'm going to stop there, Benita, and I shall just come out at the slides, and very happy to chat about any of those points further or take any questions.
Yes, Síle, that was very engaging and very, very important, relevant points. I can relate to all of them. Though I'm not an HR person, in detailed profile, if I say, though I'm trying to understand it through this summit and through my interactions with HR people. My first question would be, you're right. And, we cannot say that we would go back to or return back to what it was before COVID. Times have changed. Factors have changed to run businesses. So what would be the challenges of HR team, as your last step was future workplaces? So how and what are the challenges and how they can be met by HR team in planning the future workforces and workplaces?
That's a great question, Vanita. I think one of the things for me is I have observed in my practice that because I don't think we've ever seen disruptive change on the scale that we have. Pandemic, obviously, rapid acceleration of remote working, perfect storm. And one of the things that I would be concerned about, and I think HR people need to pay attention to, is, we're hearing people say the great reset, we'll start again. I'm hearing in my own country, return back to work. One of the things that I think would be really important for HR professionals, and this is something maybe they would need to use their influence in to influence others, is learn from what has worked well in the past 2 years. Because already I'm seeing, for example, in Ireland, we have a national remote working strategy for a year. Mm-hmm. In the next few months, people can request remote working. But what I would worry about is that we're not actually learning from the positives. I think it would be a missed opportunity if we all just suddenly go back to the way things were. Right. Because, again, back to the employees market, people want, in terms of what people want, the offering that employers are giving, they want, they're not necessarily looking for the job for life. They're looking at, the organization. Do they have corporate social responsibility? Is there flexibility in where and how I do my work? So I would worry that some organizations probably, and maybe they had cultures of presenteeism and, more traditional cultures that just went remote. But I've seen brilliant practice. I have seen people so engaged, they're getting that work-life balance. So I really think it's important for HR to reflect, engage, discuss with people, what has worked well? What have we learned now about how work is designed that would help us build future workforce roles? As somebody said to me a few months ago, we've talked about remote working for years, and they were saying that they felt it has been like a grand social experiment, but it has worked. Yes, there have been weaknesses. I think taking stock is really, really important. So we don't just reset the button and start where we did 2 years ago. I think that would be really important.
True. And I think now everything has to be redesigned and redeveloped, seeing this remote working into focus, into central place, because COVID is not going anywhere. As we can see, waves have been repeated, sometimes milder, sometimes stronger, and business can't stop working. Employees can't sit at home doing nothing, earning nothing. So yes, you're right that we have to take positives from what we have seen in last 2 years and develop and rebuild our workplaces and future workforces from there. So what are I would say, what are the key points that you will see that the future HR executives should consider in their line of action?
In their line of
action.
What should HR people be doing? Yeah, I think I want to try and give you some practical examples as well as broad. So obviously the hottest and biggest topic in HR is the talent management challenge. And I do strongly believe that the equality, diversity, and inclusion one, they're interrelated. I think if employers genuinely want to be inclusive, there's we know research shows us that diverse teams take longer to make decisions, but they tend to make more creative, innovative outcomes. So sometimes what I think HR needs to really be ahead of pushing this, and something, I think in terms of number one, let's take talent management. I still see some organizations where their practices, the recruitment channels they use, the selection techniques they use, the application forms, they haven't adapted and I'll give you a practical example. Some organizations that I have worked with, to apply for a role, you fill out a 20-page form and there's a lot of paperwork. in an employee's market, you could have, your attrition rate starts from, I'm a strong believer in the employee experience. It starts from the moment you open the ad. Psychologically, we could claim, that looks really good. If I face many hurdles in applying for the job, and I'm not talking about dispensing with compliance, employee-driven market, I'll go elsewhere. And I have seen research before COVID where you can see, by not having a seamless, attractive offering that makes it easy for people to apply, you can end up with high attrition rates before you even ever get to shortlist people. So I think looking at some practices that maybe we've always done it this way, and looking at what is about that employee offering, I think. And if you're, instead of having the "we are an equal opportunities employer" on the banner, what does that mean in practice? Are we looking at job descriptions? Do they actually create explicit or implicit barriers? Why are we asking that people maybe need a driving license in a job when in fact, somebody with a disability could be well capable of doing the job? So just opening the mindset there. There's plenty of evidence to show a strong business case for diversity, but not only that, it's also, I think, people want to work for inclusive employers. I have seen so many studies. They actually want to work for companies that value diversity. So that would be a very good place to start, I think, for HR.
Great. And what we were talking about, you mentioned line managers. There need to be people management skills in the line managers. What do you mean by that? And how can business or company inculcate that kind of management skill into the line managers?
That's a great question, Vanita. It's probably the most crucial and sometimes challenging question in HR. For those who might be listening who are interested in the history of HR, we're talking back to the 80s, the term human resource management first coined by Michael Beer and colleagues in Harvard. And the central tenet or the central principle of human resource management, as opposed to more traditional approaches to personnel management, is line managers, the people who directly manage people, they're at the center of HR, supported by HR, whether that's providing good practice frameworks, techniques, whether it's HR partnering with managers, giving them advice, helping them to do OD HR work. So what we mean is, and it goes back to what I said about engagement, our direct line of sight is primarily with our own manager, whether that's online or in the workplace. And they are at the heart of HR, or they should be. However, in reality, what I often see is, number one, managers who, I suppose, progress through their organizations based on their specialist skills. They are a clinician, they are an IT professional. So what gets rewarded gets measured. So if you have a job description for a manager's role, it needs to have a strong people management component, and that needs to be built into the selection process. Because very often what happens is then, even within, for example, performance management systems, managers will pay attention to what they're being measured on. And that's why I think it's critical that there has to be a people management goal in every manager's goals for the year. And very often, in my experience, where managers are put into roles and they don't have people management skills, good people management skills, I'll talk about there in a minute, they avoid difficult situations, they avoid conflict. Suddenly it escalates. And by the time they go to HR, it has perhaps damage has already been done, and it's harder then to get something back on track. So when I talk about people management skills, and I train a lot of people, managers in people management skills, that's about their communications and engagement skills, that they understand things that motivate people, that they have the ability to have meaningful, positive conversations about performance and goal setting, that they can have the difficult conversation if they have to, but that they do it with respect, with empathy, that they build up their assertiveness skills in a way that's, I respect you, you respect me, that they understand HR policies. In my experience, most managers only go to look at a HR policy when something's going wrong, there's a dignity at work or a bullying issue, or there's a grievance. And by that stage, what you'd be trying to get managers to do as well is early intervention, try and address conflict at that early stage, but know when to go to HR. But a lot of managers don't like being in that space, but it is very often because they don't have the skills and experience. That's where HR really has to partner closely with them to help them in that role.
True. So basically, you are saying that managers should not only be measured on the basis of their technical skills, but also the people management skill, because that's very important. As they go up on the hierarchy, they have to manage more and more people and reduce the conflict within the workplace. That will increase the productivity, and that will increase the well-being of the workplace as well, and of the employees.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's beautiful point you have made. So Síle, yeah, anything else that you would like to bring into this conversation from your side?
I think there's one final thing, and I mentioned it briefly earlier, Vanita, which is about that other, the organization development role. Some HR managers don't get exposure to that, but I've done a lot of work, as you mentioned earlier, in terms of helping organizations to evaluate and develop their cultures, whether that's to meet a new strategy, whether it's to meet, sometimes, for example, an organization might do an employee engagement survey and they see findings of concern. So, for example, I often go into organizations to do workshops remotely and in person. I think building the right culture is critical. We all know the cliche, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So I've seen organizations with super people management strategies, award-winning, beautiful, but what's the culture like? And, in terms of culture, there are two big parts of it. One is what we see above the cultural iceberg. So I can look at any company online and see their strategy, their mission, their policies, the organization chart, but it doesn't tell me what it's actually like to work in that place. How do things get done? And I see very often people join the organizations and they think, this isn't, that there's a gap in the psychological contract, which is what I expect and in return what you expect from me. So there's been this honeymoon period of the induction, and suddenly it's often when things go wrong, you see how culture really works. What do I mean by culture? Some of the things you've mentioned there, Vanita, how communications works, how conflict is resolved, levels of trust, psychological safety, leadership, team working, bias. So they are some of the many things that really form the fabric of an organization. So I think it's really important as well, as back to your really good question earlier about what should we be doing as we will see continued variants of concern with COVID, but what should we be focusing on? I would say, in addition to talent management EDI, the third biggest challenge is building inclusive cultures, because people have been, really struggling with maybe not feeling socially connected with people who've never seen the office. So I think if you want to build a brand that will genuinely attract and engage people, it goes deeper than policies and getting people in, keeping people. It is about build, and that has to start at the top. It's not just the role of HR, it's the collective leadership, and also a lot of research into culture shows that the critical role of line managers in it as well. Back to our little discussion there about that line of sight. So that's a big challenge. It's a long journey. Culture change doesn't happen overnight, but HR certainly has a key role, I think, to influence culture change, but it has to be a collective leadership process, I think, to genuinely work.
Thanks, Síle, on that note, I will end this session. Thank you so much for sharing your inputs with us. I'm sure our HR executives and business students would learn a lot from